Now, apologies. Okay, got it. We're being recorded. Good. I'm going to be switching back and forth between screens. So I do mean to be looking at you. You're actually over here on the screen for me. So but let me tell you a little bit about myself. Scott gave you just a little bit of an introduction, but I'll tell you a little bit more. I'm a philosophy professor. I also teach courses in religion, classics, environmental studies. I love to take students traveling with me and to teach students how not just to read books, but how to read landscapes. So that we spend, for instance, time in Morocco or time in Central America, and we're looking at the landscape as a kind of text. That's relevant for what I'm going to talk to you about for the rest of our little seminar here. I'll tell you that as well, that I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how I got here. And feel free to be taking some notes. If you have questions for me, you can put them in the chat, or you can also set aside some time right towards the end when you can ask me questions, because the questions that you ask are probably going to be more important than anything that I say. So let me start with this. I graduated from college in 1991. And when I graduated, I stopped reading. For 3 months, I barely read a thing. And I think that the reason why is that I was frankly burned out. Reading over the course of 4 years of undergraduate study had become work. Now, I was studying Spanish literature, Spanish language literature. I was studying poetry. So I certainly enjoyed reading. I studied a number of other foreign languages and literatures in those languages. And every bit of it, every little bit of it, I enjoyed before college and even at the beginning of college. And something happened during college such that the reading became work. That's one of the things that drives me today as a teacher, not to make reading into work, but to figure out why reading feels like work, especially when it's something fun like reading poetry, which ought to be something that is joyful and inspiring for us, something that maybe helps us to resituate our lives, to examine ourselves, to examine our habits of thinking. At any rate, when I was in college, especially my last year of college, I felt like I was getting less and less out of reading and doing more and more work. And I didn't enjoy that. So I took some time off. Now, a funny thing happened. Those 3 months of not reading wound up becoming time when I felt like I was recharging. And the first things that I went to read were the very textbooks that I still had from my college years. I opened them again with a new kind of curiosity. And I wound up rereading some of those textbooks over the next 7 years before I went to graduate school. I realized that there was a lot in those books that had been joyful to me at some point, even some of the books that I hadn't intended to read. I didn't intend to be a philosophy major, and I wasn't a philosophy major as an undergraduate. In fact, I took one philosophy course as an undergraduate, and I dropped it halfway through because I didn't really enjoy it. I'd read Plato on my own and really loved reading Plato. And then I took Plato into a philosophy course, and somehow reading Plato became laborious. What I really want to do today, and over if you wind up taking this course that I'll be offering over the next few weeks, is to share with you some of how reading became joyful for me again. That's not just about having fun with reading, but it's about making learning into something that is joy-giving, not just to you as a reader, but to everyone else who is part of your community. Somehow, when I went off to graduate school, or actually in the years before I went off to graduate school, and then during that time, I not only got better at reading, but I got better at enjoying reading and sharing that joy with other people. So let's see if I can share some of that joy with you today. So I'm going to try to teach you how to read a little bit faster. I'm going to try to do that in such a way that I would need to offer a caveat. I'm not going to teach you magic. I'm not going to, sometimes I've seen people offer some sort of way where you can instantly become somebody who can just hold a book and now you know everything that's in it. I'll teach you how to read a little bit faster, but I'm not going to teach you how to get it with computer-like accuracy. But another thing that I want to teach you today, and much more in depth for those of you who wind up signing up for the full class, is how to think about books as being part of a living ecosystem. Like I said before, how to think about books as having their own landscape. Where do they come from? How do books live their lives? And how do we encounter them? Asking those questions, I think, can make a really big difference in giving us a lot more joy in our reading. So here's a quick overview in 3 parts of what I want to do today. I'm going to show you how to read fast and how to retain some of what you read. Second, I'm going to teach you how to read the landscape of a book. And third, I'm going to offer some thoughts on how books relate to one another and how to organize your reading. None of this is going to be new to you, by the way. And that's really good news because you have very little that you have to learn. But nevertheless, I think that you'll find that the way that it's presented might be a little bit new to you. Let me invite you to do something right now. So you can see the room that I'm in. I'll tell you, the room where I'm in right now is, this was my daughter's bedroom back before she went off to college. She's since gotten married and moved out. She's an attorney in Chicago, so she doesn't live here anymore. But I like to keep this room, which this is my office at home, but it also still has all sorts of images of my daughter living here as a child, where she read for joy. What I want to invite you to do is take a quick look at the room that I'm in, and then close your eyes or just turn away from the screen for a moment. And you don't have to say it, but when you look away from this room, can you remember how it's organized? For instance, do you remember where the door is? Do you remember where the map is? Can you see anything else that's in the room? Now, my guess is that you can remember where the door is. Feel free to open your eyes and look again. You can see where the map is. You probably remembered at least generally some of the other things. Feel free to do the same with some of the other rooms that you're looking in with, so you see that some of your fellow participants have their cameras on. Have a quick look at those rooms and look aside. You'll see that you have the ability to glance at some space and take in an awful lot of information really quickly. By the way, we have with us one of my colleagues, Lindsay Twa. I won't put Lindsay on the spot right here, but I think that Lindsay could probably tell us an awful lot about art history and how much information can be conveyed through a simple image. You and I have a whole bunch of learned habits of learning. That is to say, the way that we learn has been taught to us just as much as the content of our learning has been taught to us. And a lot of those habits of learning have come to us with unintended consequences. Let me throw out a possibility to you. We've seen lately an awful lot about how social media conditions us. You get the like on that post that you put up on Twitter or on Facebook. You get people watching your TikTok, and you get a little jolt of some sort of boost, some good feeling that comes from that. And that draws you back into the social media. Or when you're scrolling through something, you get rewarded for having your eyes on the screen. What we know more and more is that the people who run social media have figured out how to keep our attention. And to some degree, that's fun and it's good because it keeps us connected to other people. But we've also seen that to some degree, it's not so good because it can keep us connected to whatever happens to pass through our social media feed. And there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of curating of that. There's a danger that some of our education can be like that too. I noticed, for instance, as an undergraduate, in those years when I was reading, but losing some of my love for reading, that increasingly my attention was on grades. For instance, I'd read some text from some medieval Spanish text, a poem or an essay, and then I'd write about it. And I got better at the skills of writing, of course. I'd hand in that paper. A few days later, the professor would give it back to me. And the thing that I did first, and maybe some of you can relate to this, is I would flip to the last page and look at what the grade was. And then, of course, I would look to see if there were other comments. But the thing that I wanted to know first was this an A? Was it a B, a C, an A plus or an A minus? I think that this is one of the ways that we wind up habituating people to learn, by telling people that you have learned or you haven't learned and quantifying it. To some degree, that can be really helpful because it can let us know that you have met expectations, you've learned something well. But think about the ways that it can also habituate us and maybe even get us to focus on the wrong things. I won't speak for you, but I can speak for myself that over time, I got more and more attentive to the grades without wanting to, and less attentive to the texts that I was reading. So much so that when I graduated from college, I didn't want to have anything else to do with them for the next few months. What I'm really grateful for is, over time, through reading texts that I was interested in, poems, scripture, history, philosophy, a few things returned to me. One of them was childlike wonder and curiosity. Another one was learning how to say, I don't know, and not being afraid that I was going to get a bad grade for that. Just think about how little we reward people for admitting what they don't know, and how much shame there can be with getting a low grade. And even that the shame that can be indirect, like knowing that if you got just a little bit lower grade, that might mean that you have a harder time getting into the job or the graduate school that you wanted to get into. One of the really important things that happened was I rediscovered my place in a community of other readers. And a lot of that has to do with understanding what a book is. So what I want to do is show you how I read and read fast. I was interviewed for a podcast. John Meyer has a podcast called Lead More. I'll recommend it to you. Lead More, Leadmore. It's one word. It's a fun podcast. I think it's really well done. While John and I were talking, he asked me about my reading habits, and I mentioned that I read several hundred books a year, probably about 330 books a year. I didn't think that that would be all that surprising, but it wound up becoming one of those things that went viral. And I've since been interviewed by other people who want to know, how on earth do you do that? Well, what I have to say to you is I don't read every single word and memorize the books. In fact, to give you a picture of what I do, well, I've already given you a picture. You glance at the room around me and you take in an awful lot of information, right? Have any of you ever had that experience where you're trying to read a book, especially one that you have to read, and you realize that you've been looking at the words for a long time and you have no idea what any of them say? It's a little bit like that experience of driving down the highway. This can be frightening. Thankfully, in South Dakota, we don't have a lot of traffic, but you can be on the interstate and it's almost like you come out of a trance and you realize, I don't know what just happened to the last mile. I hope I didn't go by the exit that I was supposed to get off at, something like that. So something is happening to us when we're reading. We have a habit of reading that tells us that we have to look at every word. Somehow following the words in sequence, that's going to be one of the things that helps us to get what's on the page. Another one of the habits that we have is of highlighting. And sometimes I've seen my students' books where every single word on every page is highlighted. And when I see that, I think, oh my goodness, you must be tired. Was that the caffeine doing that? How much are you spending on highlighters? Sometimes, by the way, there are some really good practices of highlighting. So if you highlight, please feel no shame about that. But what I want to introduce you to is something that doesn't involve any highlighting, and it doesn't involve looking at every single word on the page. Let's get there through another image. Instead of having to give a book report, I want you to imagine maybe in your current workplace, maybe in school, you have to give a report not about a book, but about a place that you've never been to. In fact, I'll invite you to South Dakota if you've never been here. If you've been here, think of some other place that you haven't been to. South Dakota is big enough that it takes about 6 hours to drive across it. If you're driving on the interstate at top speed, which here is 80 miles an hour, so that's pretty darn fast. If I asked you to give a report on South Dakota, but I gave you 1 day before you give the report to learn what you can about South Dakota, how might you do it? Well, one way to do it, of course, would be to open up the Wikipedia page, find out who the current governor is, who our senators are, major cities, that sort of thing. And you could collect a bunch of data. You could even have the Wikipedia page open on some alternate screen while you're giving the report on Zoom. But let's imagine that we do it without reading. Instead of reading a text, let's read the state itself. Now, let me give you another tool with which to do this. I'm going to give you access to my high-speed helicopter and a skilled pilot who can land anywhere. By the way, I don't have either a helicopter or a pilot. So in case anyone's going to ask me for that later on, I don't. I apologize. I wish I did. But if I did, I would give you access to this helicopter and to this pilot and all the fuel that you need. And I'm going to give you a day to know the state. What might you do to get to know the state? My guess is that most of you would want to get up pretty high and just sort of get the eagle's eye view of the state. You want to know, what's the lay of the land? Where are the rivers, the lakes, the mountains? Where are the badlands? Now, this is a pretty fast helicopter, so in a day you can fly back and forth across the state faster than you can drive. So maybe you'll fly across the state and back, go across the north side and come back across the south side. At the end of that, my guess is you're going to have a pretty good picture of what South Dakota looks like. For our purposes, imagine it's a cloudless day as well. So good, you're in the middle of the day, you got good sunshine. You'll probably see the Missouri River running right down the middle of the state. You'll see over on the western side of the state, we've got the Black Hills. Right in the south and in the southwest and in the center of the state, we've got the Badlands, and they're pretty easy to see from the sky. In fact, if you wanted to, you could pull up a Google Maps satellite view and you would see all of these same things. And over on the east side of the state, you'd see that it's pretty green with lots of little lakes and a few small rivers. At the end of that one flight back and forth across the state, you haven't spent your whole day. You've spent maybe a few hours of it. Maybe you've spent half the day, and you've seen a good deal of the state. You could probably give a pretty decent report on what South Dakota looks like. Now, my guess is you'd also feel like it was an inadequate report, because after all, you haven't really visited the state. You've just flown over it. And anyone who lives in the Dakotas is accustomed to hearing people talk about where we live as flyover country. They're not wrong. We see lots of planes flying overhead, knowing that people are going from Seattle to New York and they're not going to stop. We sometimes wave at them. So what we would love is for those folks to come and land in Rapid City, Aberdeen, Sioux Falls, Fargo. So land in one of the cities in one of our states here and get to know it just a little bit better. Maybe you've only got time for one meal. Now, consider that helicopter ride you took. You saw what the state looks like. Did something catch your eye? Maybe what you'd love to do is see the Badlands. And after all, they didn't look so very bad. Why are they called Badlands? Maybe you're drawn to rivers and you'd really love to see that river that takes up so much of the center of our state, visit its dams. And if you land in front of one of the dams, to see the bald eagles or sometimes the snowy owls that gather there. Or perhaps you're a city person. Sioux Falls is the largest city in South Dakota. You'd love to come here and maybe have a meal. We would welcome you. After that, you still don't know the whole state, but your report just got a lot better because you can give the lay of the land and you can tell us some detail of the state. Now, you've still got a little bit of time left in your day. You still have my helicopter. We refueled it for you while you were having your meal at M.B. Haskett's Delicatessen on Phillips Avenue here in Sioux Falls. Good meal. Glad you enjoyed it. So get up and fly around one more time. Think of what that's going to do to your knowledge of the state. You got the one big eagle's eye overview of the state, enough that you could choose one spot, maybe two spots where you'd land for a little while, walk around, meet some people, recognize that this is not just geography, but culture, that you're meeting people, getting to know the food. Maybe you tried some chislic, the South Dakota state nosh, the official state nosh. And then you flew over one more time. And that time that you landed, or those times you landed, now you could put them into context. All right, so what I'm doing here is I'm giving you a picture of how you get to go to know a geographic place, how you get to know the lay of the land. But I've also just introduced you to what I tell my students they ought to do whenever they read a book. For some of them, it's frightening that I suggest that when you've got a new book, this one just arrived in the mail today, I haven't read it yet. When you've got a new book, I want you to read it not once, but 3 times. Because lots of us think, oh my goodness, 3 times. This has how many pages? You're watching me open this book for the first time. Let's just see how many pages are here. 138 pages. Oh goodness. 138 pages. Well, if I take a couple of minutes per page, this is going to take me hours for each reading. There's no way I'm going to spend 6 or 7 hours reading this. Well, what I want to suggest to you is that you could do that first reading in about 138 seconds, and your third reading in about 138 seconds, because you're already in possession of a high-speed helicopter with all the fuel that you need to get through a text like this. The way that we do it is like this. And I'll hold this up. I think you can see this clearly enough. In fact, I'll tilt it just a little bit. So the title of this book, by the way, is How to Innovate, an Ancient Guide to Creative Thinking. So these are texts from Aristotle, but selected by a modern reader. So somebody who has read Aristotle and thinks that he's read Aristotle well enough to introduce Aristotle. Here I am on this first page. What I'm going to do on this page is the same thing that I invited you to do when you looked at the room around me. Glance at it quickly and then glance away. Now, you can feel free to do this if you've got a book nearby, especially one that you haven't looked at before, but even if you have looked at it, open it to a random page, but allow yourself no more than 1 second to look at that page and then look away. My guess is that if you do that, you'll pick up about 4 words off that page. Very likely there'll be some of the words that are capitalized or words that begin sentences. That's fine. Those words, I saw certain Greeks and culture. That's it. Now let me teach you just one other thing that you can do to make this a little bit better. Use your finger and take the finger, and in that 1 second, run it down the center of the page. Follow your finger with your eyes. What that does is it keeps you from stopping anywhere. That thing that happens to us when we freeze, we go, oh, I've got to read through this, and then we start to fall asleep and we wake up and say, I've been staring at this page for I don't know how long and I don't know where it is or what I've read. This is a way of avoiding that altogether. All we're doing is we're getting a quick snapshot of each page. Next page, same thing, and so on. I'm giving 1 second per page. Now, at the end of that, if you do that with a brand new book, you can probably give a similar report about that book to the person who has flown over South Dakota. Yep, I've seen that the ground appears to be in squares of different colors, they might say. I see that there's a river running down the middle of the state. There are mountains on one side. It's not a really detailed map of South Dakota. And at the same time, none of us would deny that they've actually seen South Dakota. Okay, one more trick. I said, read with your finger. I'm going to suggest that you read not with a highlighter, but with a pencil as well. So I keep a pencil in my hand. See, this is sort of like chopsticks method. I've got one finger free and I'm holding the pencil here ready to go, but I'm not going to highlight anything. Instead, I'm just going to open up to a random new page. As I read through here, as I run my finger down this page, it might be that something catches my eye. I don't know about you, I get really curious when I look at a text. Like I'll see something like, here's the word gymnasium. The uppermost deck contained a gymnasium. The uppermost deck of what? Now I've got to know. I got to dig in. What I'm going to do is resist that. And instead, I'm going to make a mark right here. The uppermost deck contained a gymnasium, a vertical mark, because I can make that really quickly. And I don't have to go uppermost deck contained a gymnasium and boardwalks. Oh my goodness, see, I'm already drawn in. I want to know more. When I do that, my first time through, and I just make a few vertical marks, I'm not going to mark everything, but just a few vertical marks. All I've done, it's sort of like when I was flying over the state, if I had some sort of digital map, I might tap it and say, oh, let's come back and look at that and look at that and look at that. Remembering that after that first fly over the state of South Dakota, I don't have time to stop and look at all of those places. Nevertheless, I want to stop and look at a few. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through this text, going through again and again each page. By the way, this text is going to be one that's going to be odd for many of us because, as you can see, one page is in Greek and one page is in English. Sometimes seeing a text in another language can be very confusing to us. Let me offer something else that's even harder for me since I'm a Greek professor, but I'm not an Arabic professor. So here is another book that has been on my shelf that I've been starting to read, Classical Poems by Arab Women. So these are poems by women in Arabic.
Oh boy.
Written throughout the centuries, thankfully with translations, but I know that the translations aren't perfect. I'm going to do the same thing. Now, during the class, if you take the whole class with me, I'll come back to poetry because poetry gets a different kind of reading. But nevertheless, even if you don't read Arabic, you can look at this and see something about the arrangement of the words that might have you say, I need to know more. Why are the words arranged like that? Still, getting ahead of myself. We'll come back to poetry later on. As I go through this text, I'm making all those marks. Now I'm going to go back for a second read through, and the second read through will be almost as fast, 138 pages. The first reading was 138 seconds. The third reading will be about 138 seconds. But the second reading, I'm going to allow myself to choose just a few of those places to land the helicopter and dwell on a page. If I go back to that page where I found the gymnasium, now I already lost the page, but if I go back to that page, I can probably find it pretty quickly just by looking for the vertical mark. Then I might say, I'd like to know more about this. All these cabins had mosaic floors made from a variety of stones, arranged to amazing effect to depict the whole story of the Iliad, and the furniture, ceilings, and doors were also elaborately worked. The uppermost deck contained a gymnasium and boardwalks in proportion to the size of the ship, in which were painted colorful flower beds brimming with flowers. Well, that's really interesting to me. Now I want to know a little bit more about this ship. I'm going to allow myself just a little bit of time to figure out what's the context of this. Say more. I'll probably spend time dwelling on about 10 or 12 pages here. And then I'm going to discipline myself to read through to the end again. I might stop at one or two other places. And then my third reading. So again, the first reading, I went through fast without stopping, making a few vertical marks. And you saw that I quickly found that vertical mark again. The second reading, I go through fast and I allow myself to dwell on one or more of those vertical marks. This is a little bit like getting off the helicopter, having a meal, getting to know a few people. Have I met all of South Dakota? No. Maybe I've met one of the waitstaff at the restaurant, but I've gotten to know it a little bit better. And then the third method, so the third reading of you go through it, the whole thing again, and put your little bit of knowledge into context. And here's the thing, at the end of all that, you really have not read the book well. And that's something that we have to keep in mind. We really haven't read the book well. I do not expect to become an expert in classical poems by Arab women. What I do hope is that the next time that I'm teaching in Morocco with my students, I'll have a few of these memorized, at least in translation, and I'll have improved my ability to read Arabic. But I'm not going to be an expert here. I'll have a little bit more of a deeper knowledge of the poems, especially the ones that were written in Morocco. With this, I'll have a better knowledge of whether this is a book that I would teach my students. Each book is going to require a different kind of reading, but they're all going to take, for me, that same 3 pass of reading, the 3 times through with pencil in hand. And here's the thing. If I do that all by myself, I really haven't read the book all that well. But if I do that with a few friends, one of 2 things is going to happen. Either all of us will have had our eyes caught by the same passage, in which case there was probably something really important about that passage. Or all of us are going to have our eyes caught by different passages, in which case when we gather to give our report on the book, we're going to be able to teach one another a lot better. I'll say, what about that passage about the gymnasium and the mosaic floors on the ship? And somebody else will say, well, that part wasn't interesting to me. I skipped over that, but I was really interested in the principle of rotation. And I'll say, teach me about that. What we're doing in all of this is we're trying to break a habit of reading, where reading is something linear. You have to look at every word, let the light bounce off the page, hit your retina, and somehow you register it. And then you think about a grade. We're breaking that habit. Instead, we're looking at this book as a place where we might visit, a beautiful landscape that somebody lives in. And in fact, this landscape is surrounded by other landscapes, just as South Dakota is surrounded by other states. And people move here and people move away. The river continues to flow. The wind blows across the state. Things are changing about the state all the time. And things are changing about books all the time. Now, I said I was going to do three things, and I want to wrap this up in just a couple of notes, because I've done all three of the things, but you might not have noticed it. I said I was going to show you how to read. I also said I was going to show you how to increase your retention and comprehension by understanding how the book is structured. Well, I haven't really talked about the structure of the book, but I've shown you a little bit of how to increase your retention and your comprehension by allowing yourself to dwell in a little bit of it. I've lived in South Dakota for 16 years, and I feel like I know South Dakota better than I knew when I moved here. But there's still so much more for me to explore. I love the city of London, and every time I'm in London, I've got a few places that I return to, but I still feel like there's so much more for me to visit. And the same with all sorts of other places that I go to. A lot of my reading is simply returning to texts because they were delightful. Every now and then somebody will say, there's no way you read as many books as you do a year. And what they mean is probably right. I don't tend to read every single word of every book. But what I do is I encounter those books as landscapes, and I encounter them with joy. And I deepen my knowledge of those books each time I revisit them. As I said, one thing that we can do is pay attention to the structure of the book. Maybe that Wikipedia article about South Dakota is a helpful way to do that. You did your flyovers of the state, you landed in one place, but now you've got questions. Why is the capital of the state in the middle, where there seems to be so little population? Why are there so many dams on the river? And why is this book organized the way that it is? I want to suggest that one of the habits that I got into as a student was a bad one, and that was skipping the stuff at the beginning of the book and the end of the book. I tended to skip the table of contents and the introduction because they seemed like blather to me. They seemed like filler material. I've since found that things like this, Princeton University Press, Princeton and Oxford, tell me quite a lot about a book right away. Ancient Wisdom for Modern Readers, a list of all the other texts that are in this series, tell me a lot about the context, the ecosystem in which this book lives. Even this copyright page tells me an awful lot because it tells me a little bit about the author. And when I get to the table of contents, this is one page to which I might give a full minute, because this page tells me a lot about what the author was thinking when he or she or they put the book together. Similarly, when I'm all done, if this book has an index, or if in this case it has a set of further reading or notes, I think it's sometimes worth going through that, because what the author is telling you when they show you further reading is that this book lives in an ecosystem. And it's almost like they're saying, I flew through this book, and here's some of the highlights that I saw. Here's a travel guide if you want to know more about this place. If you want to know more about this book, even just reading the books, the titles of the books that the author has selected can go a long way. Anyway, there you have it. That's my 3-step method of reading better and retaining more. There's much more that I could say, and to get more, you'll have to take the full class or meet me in my office for a cup of tea, I suppose. But just to quickly review, I read the book 3 times fast, allowing myself to dwell for a little while. I allow myself to dwell for a little while also on the things that the author and the publisher tell me about the context and the ecosystem in which the book lives. And I allow myself to make just a few notes so that I can return to the book and enjoy it the same way that I might return to a favorite city and enjoy that. With that, I'll take some time for some questions. It looks like we've got a few showing up in the chat over here. Scott, I don't know if you've got a way that you want to do this.
Yeah, no, that's great. I would encourage you, you can start putting questions in the chat and we'll take those. One thing that really stuck out to me was the idea of a book in an ecosystem. And one thing we're thinking about at the University of Jamestown is the idea of knowledge in an ecosystem. You know, I think we all live in the knowledge economy. And one thing we're trying to explore is, what does it look like to learn your entire life, to continue to get better at the things that matter in this knowledge economy? And that was really the birth of the program that I'm now leading called UJ Accelerated, which is how can we learn in short courses and certificates the skills you need to get better at your job or to find a new job. And I think as we learned today, we don't always take a step back and learn how to learn or learn the things we need to excel, whether you're a business strategist or a creator or just a curious person. And that's what we're going to do in Dave's course. So as you ask your questions, I'll share my screen real quickly and just show you what we're doing starting the week before Thanksgiving. We're going to have a course called Metalearning, which is all about learning how to learn, distilling that information into useful bits that you can then share out. So I'll put a link in the chat and an email here. You can learn all about it. And it's a 4-week course that runs from the week before Thanksgiving to the week before Christmas, basically ends the 16th of December. And we'd love to have you join that. Dave will be teaching that, so you get to spend time with him. It's open to anyone, no experience required, no degree required. What's required is a curious mind, people who want to learn. So I'll put that link in the chat. And also as an attendee, you have a special code, which is Dave. And I'll email that to you as well. But if you decide to take the course and use the word Dave, you'll get the special fast reader discount here. I think what's really fun here, seeing all of you, is seeing the diversity of people from all over the world. You know, Nazreen's calling in from Tunis. We have the president of the University of Jamestown, President Peterson, is on here learning. We have students. We have another beautiful expert reader, Dan Collison, is on. And I think it really highlights the fact that learning how to learn is something we all need to do. So we would love to do that with you starting in a couple weeks. So what I'll do is kind of look over at the questions, Dave, and you can grab some as well. But let's see what we got here. I would love my question kind of reading this was like, okay, so I'm at a job, right? I'm getting reports. I'm getting like, not novels, right? Things that, what happens if I miss something? So how do you get over this fear of like, I'm going to miss the important stuff and my boss needs me to see that? Or how do you apply this to like business intelligence, maybe you could say?
Right. Yeah, this is a great question. And I will have to say that I have gone very fast through some of this. So in the course, in the full course, we'll talk about different kinds of texts. One of the things that I'll begin with actually is poetry. I'll also have you read a couple of texts that are quite dense from the 1800s. But yeah, they're written by a chemist. A Harvard-trained chemist in the 1800s, and they're wicked hard to understand, if you'll allow me to use that New England intensifier. But I'll teach you how to approach text like that. And Scott, I think that part of it is allowing yourself, just as you say, the freedom to read through at least once with just sort of browsing through, because you'll wind up seeing a lot that you wouldn't see if you go through it piece by piece. I will say that in the time that I've spent in law school, I've taken classes at Vermont Law School and at University of Montana Law School. I found that if I'm going to read a Supreme Court decision, I really do need to read it word for word, especially if I'm going to be asked to brief that case. But there are also techniques that I can use for reading law in particular that allow me to do more or less the same thing that I've done before. Look at the context, look at the ecosystem, go through it quickly, allow keywords to pop out. And then I go back knowing that there are going to be just 4 or 5 things that I'm going to look for in that case. And that's going to help me to understand the context. If I were looking at a set of reports as a manager, if I were looking at a business proposition, or if I were looking at some other kind of technical manual or technical report, again, I'd have to figure out what those tools are, but I can still use more or less the same method for that.
That's great. We had two questions I'll throw you together in case they're related in your mind. One was, how do you apply this to digital books or digital reading, and how might that be different? And then Dan had a good question about other kerning techniques. So besides vertical lines, are there other things we can do? And maybe, again, digital versus physical, that might change how we make those little hash marks.
Right. So I will tell you, I do have a Kindle and I do use digital books sometimes. I found that one of the downsides of those books is that they're too slow. They don't change pages as quickly as I can change paper pages. So I tend not to do a lot of reading on Kindle. I use that for stuff that I know that I'm going to steep in, like reading a novel. I don't want to read novels fast. And honestly, there are times when I will spend an entire day with a haiku. It's just 3 lines. So I can have all sorts of haikus of Basho on my Kindle because I'm just going to open it up, dwell with it for a little while, maybe set it aside. That being said, for me, what matters then is I've got Kindle on 3 different devices. And if I want to read something fast, I make sure that it's one of the devices that has very quick refresh and that can allow me to highlight things. I don't tend to do a lot of reading on a Kindle if I'm going to be teaching from it or if I'm going to be citing it later on in an academic paper, which is my style of writing, precisely because the Kindle very rarely makes it easy for me to make an academic citation. And one of the things that I'll talk about later on in the class is how to make a citation that will allow other people to find your sort of trail of breadcrumbs, because I think that that's part of being a community of readers. As for the other kerning techniques, when I've gone through the book 3 times, as I said, it's common for me to go back to a book other times as well. So as I go through there and I'm making those vertical lines, sometimes I'll make a second vertical line. Or if one really stood out to me, then I'll make some other quick mark like a star or a check mark or something like that. And after I've read through that passage, I very often will go to the top of the page and say, maybe just write the word gymnasium or Homer's Iliad, something like that, or a quick summary of what was there. That's my 4th read, probably. And my 5th read, I'm going to go back and at the beginning of the chapter or somewhere on the end pages, I'm going to write a little summary of what I learned from the book so that the next time I return to this book, I can open up to the very last page or to the first page of any chapter and remind myself really quickly what that chapter or that book was about. Obviously, I'm biased towards paper books because paper books allow me to flip the pages quickly and allow me to make these sort of analog marks in them. But there are digital analogs to the digital analogs. Can I say that? There are digital ways that we can do more or less the same thing, for instance, with a PDF. So
that's great.
I realize we have limited time here.
Well,
so
we'll take
Scott.
one more question from President Polly Peterson and then one comment from Nazreen. So Dr. Peterson, do you want to ask your question about grading?
Yeah, I thought that was apropos because we've been discussing that at UJ Accelerated for a while now. But you know, I've been passionate over the years that higher education is about developing a love for learning.
Right.
And I've questioned the concept you brought up, which is when somebody's assessing my learning through a grade, it's subjective to a certain extent. You may grade me one way, and a faculty member in another faculty might grade it differently. And it does limit my willingness to learn because I'm trying to make you, the grader, happy or trying to learn what you're telling me is important. How are you addressing that in your courses? I mean, how do we get past that?
I had 2 really, I love the question, by the way. It speaks to my heart. I had 2 really interesting experiences in education that framed my own education. One of them was that I began in Montessori school. My first 5 years of education were playful. And I realized later on in my 30s that I was actually bored in between Montessori school and graduate school. And I didn't notice it because it just seemed normal. So that's one of the bookends. The other bookend was I went to a graduate school where we had no grades and where we had no exams. The only exams we had were oral exams, and my responsibility as a student was to bring good questions to the exam so that a conversation could ensue. It was at that graduate school that I first heard a professor say, "I don't know," in answer to a question. And I still remember how shocking it was because none of my undergraduate professors had ever said, "I don't know." That tells me that they were also part of that same ecosystem where they were afraid to admit, or maybe even didn't even realize that they were afraid to admit what they didn't know. So in answer to your question, one of the things that I'm doing more and more is saying to my students, I don't know. Trying to invite them to come into the reading with me, and doing this crazy thing where I'm willing to be recorded saying, I read this book really quickly, and no, I didn't read every word. And yes, there's a lot that I missed, which is why I'm going to go back to it again. I think being a lifelong learner involves recognizing that it's okay not to know.
Great. Yeah, and we're excited, as I mentioned, I think the power of these cohort-based courses, that I would call these, is really learning from one another. And so that's really what this meta-learning course will be like. And I wanted to invite Nesreen up. She's actually in a course we're teaching right now on financial fluency, kind of the same structure where we meet for 90 minutes twice a week. And so Nesreen, could you just share a little bit about that experience and how it's been? We're about halfway through that course right now.
Yeah, it's been a wonderful experience so far. We get to see Scott's baby doing a cameo sometimes. And we have a dear peer like Crystal who's here. The experience is great because I really appreciate the approach. I'm someone who gets overwhelmed easily with numbers, especially with financial fluency. I do knowledge management. I'm a knowledge management consultant, and I have a literary background. So actually I'm a French major. That's why I've been smiling where you were speaking, doctor. I really get overwhelmed by numbers, and I really appreciate the approach that Sir Stephen Wilkinson makes this course, because it gives us confidence, first of all, to look at the numbers and to examine things slowly but surely. It's like having someone showing you how to walk before you can run in the wild. And I also really appreciate the vibe. This is the first, to be honest, this is the first financial fluency course that's not boring. And I think when you're learning something that is difficult, like for me, where I have the impression that it's difficult, making it fun is a big aspect that helps learning, especially when you're an adult and when you're a kid. But I really appreciate that. The materials also are great. We have a workbook, and it's really laid out like step by step. So in every step we feel welcomed, and we feel supported by the team of teachers or Scott, and by also the students.
Well, thanks. That's really nice to hear. We'll do the same thing here where, in Dave's course, not only are you going to learn, but you're going to have an artifact at the end that captures all of this information. And we would love for you to join us. I think it's going to be a great way to improve something that we all do every day, which is reading, learning, distilling, sharing. So I'll put that link in the chat, and happy to answer any questions you have now or in the future about that. Dave, any final thoughts as we kind of wrap up with this illustrious group? And we're so excited to have you join us for the next kind of 4 weeks for a sprint. And I kind of think about it as a journey group, right? Whoever signs up for this course, that's going to be kind of the group that you journey with and help one another learn with. And so we're excited to have you in our journey group.
I'll wrap up with this, Scott. First of all, thanks to everybody for joining us today. And thanks, Scott, for giving me the opportunity to not only to teach this, but to show off as somebody who knows how much he doesn't know and who's not afraid to admit it.
That's great. Well, we're so thankful you all jumped on. We'll be offering additional courses in the future, and you can look on our website for some of the other things we're teaching around cybersecurity and project management in the future, digital marketing. So there's going to be a lot around educational sprints, and really that idea that we can all continue to learn and accelerate our careers and our opportunities. And any feedback you have is warmly welcome. Like David said, we don't have the answers. We're here to learn. So tell us what we don't know. Tell us what we should change. And most importantly, if you're able, join us the week before Thanksgiving. The 15th of November is the first online kickoff, with the first class on the 18th of November. We'd love to see you then and learn together. So for now, we'll say goodbye. And if you want to share this or the promo code Dave with any of your friends, you are welcome to. We'll have this link up on that page that I linked by the end of the day. So you can share that video or just go back and watch it on your second or third pass. So great to have you all, and hope you have a wonderful day. Good to see you.
Thanks, you too,
Bye-bye.
Scott. Thanks, everybody.